I was already half asleep when a knocking started. 3 soft raps against my apartment door, then nothing. Then 3 more, barely audible through the thin walls. The kind of knocking that comes from someone who isn't sure they should be there at all. The clock on my nightstand glowed 12:47 in the morning. I lay still for a moment, listening to the silence that followed, wondering if I'd imagined it. The building was old, full of settling sounds and creaking pipes. Maybe it was just the radiator again, or Mrs. Chun upstairs moving furniture at impossible hours. But then it came again, slower this time, deliberate. The sound of knuckles against wood, hesitant but real. I pulled on the first shirt I could find and padded barefoot across the cold hardwood floor. My apartment was small enough that everything felt close together in the dark. The couch where I'd fallen asleep reading. The kitchen counter cluttered with unwashed dishes. The stack of textbooks I kept meaning to return to the library. Through the peephole, I could see a figure standing in the dim hallway light. Tall, familiar silhouette. A duffel bag hanging from one shoulder like dead weight. Simon. I knew it was him before I even turned the deadbolt. Something about the way he carried himself, even in shadow. The slight forward lean of his shoulders that I'd memorized during countless study sessions and late-night conversations about nothing important. When I opened the door, the sight of him hit me like cold air. His dark hair was damp, clinging to his forehead. His jacket hung open despite the October chill, and his eyes were red-rimmed and glassy in a way that made my chest tighten. "Can I stay here?" he said. His voice came out rough and thin, like he'd been using it too much or not at all. I didn't ask why. The question hung between us, obvious and unnecessary. Simon had never shown up at my door past midnight with a bag packed and that hollow look in his eyes. Something had broken. Something big enough to send him across town in the dark to the one place he thought might take him in. I stepped aside without a word, and he walked past me into the apartment. The familiar weight of him moving through my space felt different now. Heavier, more permanent. The sound of the door, closing behind him, seemed to echo longer than it should have. Like the final note of a song you can't stop humming. I turned the lock and leaned against the door frame, watching him stand in my living room as if he'd never seen it before. He let the duffel bag slide off his shoulder and hit the floor with a soft thud. The sound was too loud in the quiet apartment, and we both stared at it for a moment. A canvas bag, navy blue, probably the same one he'd taken on family trips when we were younger. Now it sat on my floor like evidence of something ending. Simon walked to the window that faced the street, pushing aside the thin curtain I'd hung there months ago. The streetlight outside cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the way his lips pressed together when he was trying not to say something. I'd known Simon for 3 years. We'd met freshman year in a statistics class neither of us wanted to take, bonding over our shared confusion about probability distributions and the professor's tendency to call on students who weren't paying attention. What started as study sessions in the library became coffee dates that ran long, then dinners when we realized we were both tired of eating alone. He was easy to be around. That was what I'd always liked about him. Simon never demanded more space than he needed or tried to fill silence with meaningless chatter. He laughed at the right moments and listened with the kind of attention that made you feel like what you were saying actually mattered. But there had always been something else, something careful about the way he talked about his family, the way he changed the subject when conversations drifted towards certain topics. I'd learned not to push, to let him reveal what he wanted to reveal in his own time. Now, standing in my apartment at nearly 1 in the morning, that careful distance felt like it was dissolving. "You want some tea?" I asked. It was the only thing I could think to offer. The only normal thing in a moment that felt anything but normal. He shook his head without turning from the window. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know where else to go." The words hit me harder than they should have. Not because they were unexpected, but because they confirmed something I'd been afraid to hope for. That when everything fell apart, I was the person he thought of. That my apartment, with its second-hand furniture and perpetually broken heater, felt like safety to him. "Don't apologize," I said. I moved closer, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands hung loose at his sides like he'd forgotten what to do with them. "You can stay as long as you need to." He finally turned from the window, and in the dim light from the street, I could see his face clearly. The redness around his eyes wasn't just from tears. There was something raw there, something that looked like it had been scraped clean. We stood there for a moment, not quite looking at each other. The apartment felt smaller somehow, as if his presence had rearranged the space around us. The couch where I'd been sleeping an hour ago. The kitchen table where we'd eaten countless meals together. Everything looked the same, but felt different, charged with a kind of electricity I didn't have a name for. I should probably shower, he said eventually. I feel like I've been walking for hours. The bathroom is right there, I told him, gesturing down the short hallway. Towels are in the closet. Take whatever you need. He picked up his bag and disappeared into the bathroom. I heard the water start running and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Alone in my living room, I tried to make sense of what was happening. Simon was here, in my space, carrying whatever had driven him from his own home in the middle of the night. The careful boundaries we'd maintained for 3 years felt like they were shifting, maybe already gone. I cleared the books and papers off the couch, folded the blanket I'd been using, tried to make the space look less like someone had been living alone for too long. But everything I touched seemed to remind me of how empty the apartment usually felt, how quiet it was most nights. The shower ran for a long time. Long enough for me to make tea anyway, even though he'd said he didn't want any. Long enough for me to stand at the kitchen counter and stare at my reflection in the dark window, wondering what I looked like to him when he'd shown up at my door. What kind of person he saw when he decided I was the one he could trust with whatever had broken him. When the water finally stopped, the apartment fell into a silence that felt different from before. Expectant, like we were both waiting for something neither of us knew how to name. He emerged from the bathroom wearing different clothes, his hair still damp but combed back from his face. The redness around his eyes had faded, but he still looked fragile in a way that made me want to do something, anything, to fix whatever had been broken. I made tea, I said, gesturing to the 2 mugs sitting on the coffee table. Thanks, he said, settling onto the couch. He wrapped his hands around the mug, but didn't drink, just held it like he needed the warmth. I sat down beside him, leaving enough space that we weren't touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The silence stretched between us, comfortable and uncomfortable at the same time. Outside, a car passed on the street below, its headlights sweeping across the wall and disappearing. The building settled around us with small creaks and sighs. Normal sounds of a normal night, but everything felt suspended, like we were waiting for something to begin or end. I wanted to ask what had happened. What had finally pushed him to pack a bag and leave whatever home he'd been trying to hold together. But the questions felt too big for the moment, too heavy for the fragile quiet we'd built around ourselves. Instead, I just sat with him, let him hold his untouched tea and stare at the wall across from us. Let the silence do whatever work it needed to do. Because sometimes being present is the only thing you can offer. Sometimes it's the only thing that matters. My apartment had never been much to look at. The kind of place you rent when you're 20 and splitting the cost of living with 3 part-time jobs and whatever financial aid covers. Mismatched furniture inherited from previous tenants who'd moved on to better things. A couch with faded blue cushions that had seen too many movie nights. A coffee table I'd found on the curb and sanded down myself, never quite managing to make it look intentional. The rug beneath our feet was something I bought at a thrift store because the hardwood got cold in winter. Deep red with a pattern that had probably meant something once, but now just looked like home to me. Bookshelves made from cinder blocks and wooden planks. Sagging under the weight of textbooks, I couldn't afford to buy new, and novels I collected like some people collected records. Half-finished mugs of tea sat on various surfaces throughout the room. Evidence of nights like this one, when sleep came in fragments and comfort meant making something warm even if you never got around to drinking it. The kitchen counter held the remnants of my attempts to keep my life organized. Bills stacked next to a coffee maker that worked when it felt like it. A small potted plant my sister had given me months ago, somehow still alive despite my best efforts to forget about it. It wasn't much, but it was safe. Ordinary in the way that felt like a luxury when you'd grown up never quite sure which version of home you'd be walking into on any given day. Here, the walls stayed the same color from one day to the next. The neighbors kept to themselves, and the landlord only called when the rent was late. Simon sat on my couch like he belonged there, which shouldn't have surprised me. He'd been here countless times before, though never like this. Never with that duffel bag sitting on my floor like a question mark. Never with the weight of whatever had driven him here pressing down on both of us. I'd met him in Professor Martinez's statistics class, freshman year. We'd both wandered in 10 minutes late on the second day, looking equally lost and underprepared. He'd slid into the seat next to me, and when Martinez started talking about standard deviation, we'd exchanged the kind of look that said we were both in way over our heads. After class, we'd walked in the same direction without planning to. Started talking about how neither of us had really wanted to take statistics but needed the credits. How college felt like an elaborate game where everyone else knew the rules, and we were still trying to figure out which end was up. What started as complaining about probability distributions became coffee between classes. Study sessions that ran longer than they should have, because we'd get distracted talking about movies we'd seen or books we'd read, or the way the light fell across the library tables in the afternoon. Simon was easy to be around in a way that felt rare. He listened like he actually cared about your answers, laughed at the right moments without trying too hard to be funny himself. When we talked about serious things, he gave them the weight they deserved. When we talked about nothing at all, he made it feel like something worth sharing. By sophomore year, we'd fallen into a rhythm. Dinner at the cheap Thai place on Tuesdays when they had student discounts. Long walks around campus when the weather was good and we needed a break from studying. Movie nights in my apartment when we were both too broke for anything that cost money. But there had always been something else there. Something careful about the way Simon talked around certain topics. His family came up in conversation like weather reports, factual and distant. His father was in business, something corporate that required suits and long hours. His mother stayed home and organized charity events that Simon described with the kind of precision that suggested he'd been coached on the right things to say. They lived in one of those suburbs where the houses all looked like they'd been designed by the same architect who believed in the importance of appearing successful. Simon would mention family dinners and weekend visits home with the kind of casual resignation that suggested they were obligations rather than choices. I learned not to push. Everyone carried their own weight when it came to family, and Simon had always seemed to carry his with the kind of quiet determination that suggested asking questions might disturb something he was working hard to keep balanced. My own family was complicated in different ways. Loud, where his was controlled. Chaotic, where his was carefully managed. But Simon had never asked me to explain the gaps in my stories, either the reasons why I called home twice a month and kept the conversation short. It was one of the things that had made our friendship work. The way we could sit together in comfortable silence when words felt like too much effort. The way we could talk for hours about books or movies or the strange logic of our professors without feeling like we needed to perform for each other. Now, sitting on my couch at nearly 2 in the morning, that careful balance felt different. The space between us charged with something I couldn't name, but could definitely feel. He still hadn't touched his tea. Just held the mug like it was anchoring him to something solid. His hair had started to dry, falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger than 21. Vulnerable in a way I'd never seen him before. The weight he'd been carrying all these years, the careful distance he'd maintained from anything that might crack the facade his family required, was finally showing. Whatever had happened tonight had stripped away the protection he'd built around himself. Left him sitting in my living room looking like he'd forgotten how to be anything other than honest. I wanted to ask what had changed, what had finally broken the careful balance he'd maintained between who he was and who he was supposed to be. But the questions felt too big for the moment, too heavy for someone who looked like he was already carrying more than he could bear. So I just sat with him, let the silence do whatever work it needed to do. Let my apartment wrap around us like the safe, ordinary place it had always been. The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Simon's breathing had settled into something steadier than when he'd first walked through my door, but his hand still trembled slightly around the mug he wasn't drinking from. Finally, he set the tea down on the coffee table and let his head fall back against the couch cushions. The movement seemed to cost him something, like he'd been holding himself upright through sheer will, and had finally decided to stop fighting gravity. "You found out," Simon said. His voice came out barely above a whisper, but in the quiet of my apartment it might as well have been a shout. "About me. About everything." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of whatever story they were carrying. I didn't ask who he was talking about. Simon had never talked much about his father, but the few times he'd come up in conversation, there had been something in Simon's voice that suggested the man was less a parent and more a force of nature you learn to navigate around. I waited, let the silence give him space to find whatever words came next. "It started with my phone," he said, staring at the ceiling like the words were written there. "I left it on the kitchen counter when I went to shower. Dad was looking for his reading glasses, saw it buzzing with messages. He said he thought it might be important." Simon's laugh was bitter, hollow in a way that made my chest ache. "It was messages from Jake. You remember Jake from my business class? We've been seeing each other for a few weeks. Nothing serious, just figuring things out. But the messages were pretty obvious about what we've been figuring out. I remember Jake, tall guy with an easy smile who joined us for coffee a few times. I noticed the way Simon looked at him when he thought no one was watching. The way conversations flowed a little smoother when Jake was around. The way Simon's whole posture changed, became more open somehow. When I came downstairs, Dad was holding my phone like it was evidence in a crime he'd been trying to solve for years. He had this look on his face. Not angry exactly, disappointed, like I'd confirmed something he'd been hoping wasn't true. Simon's hands were trembling again. He clasped them together in his lap, knuckles white with the effort of staying still. He asked me to explain what he'd read. Used that voice he saves for when he's talking to clients, all business and control. So I tried to explain. Told him Jake was just a friend at first, then admitted we'd been dating. Tried to make it sound casual, like it didn't matter that much. The clock on my wall ticked steadily in the silence that followed. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, growing fainter as it moved away from us. But then he asked if there had been others. Other guys. And I couldn't lie to him. Not with him looking at me like that, like he was trying to decide whether I was still his son or just someone who looked like me. I told him about Marcus from high school, about the guy I kissed at that party sophomore year, about how I'd been trying to figure out what it meant, what I wanted, how I dated girls too, how it wasn't about choosing one or the other, but about being honest about all of it. Simon's voice was getting stronger now, like telling the story was helping him find solid ground again. But there was still something broken in it, something that suggested the ending wasn't going to be the kind you hoped for. He didn't yell, Simon continued. That's what made it worse, I think. If he'd yelled, I could have yelled back. We could have had it out and maybe found our way through it. But he just sat there, nodding like I was confirming diagnoses of some disease he'd been watching for symptoms of. Then he told me he wasn't surprised. Said he'd wondered for years, had hoped he was wrong, but wasn't shocked to have it confirmed. Said Mom had mentioned things she'd noticed, little signs they'd been cataloging without telling me. The words were coming faster now, like Simon needed to get them all out before he lost the courage to continue. He told me he loved me, but that he couldn't support this. Couldn't have me bringing shame to the family, confusing my younger cousins, making things complicated for everyone who mattered. He said if I wanted to live this way, I'd have to do it somewhere else. That his house was for people who understood what family meant, what values actually mattered. Simon's voice finally cracked on the last words. He pressed his hands against his eyes, shoulders shaking with the effort of keeping everything contained. So I packed a bag, he said. Told him I'd rather be honest about who I am than lie about it for the rest of my life, just to make him comfortable. And he said that was my choice to make, but I'd have to live with the consequences. The apartment felt impossibly quiet after he stopped talking. Even the ticking clock seemed to have hushed itself, as if the whole world was holding its breath. I wanted to say something that would fix it, something that would take away the hurt in his voice and the way he kept pressing his hands against his eyes like he could push the tears back inside. But there weren't words for what his father had done to him, for the way love had been twisted into conditions and ultimatums. Instead, I reached over and covered one of his hands with mine. His skin was cold despite the warmth of the apartment, and when he didn't pull away, I squeezed gently. You did the right thing, I said. Coming here, choosing yourself. He looked at me then, eyes red and searching. And I realized that this moment, this trust he was placing in me, was bigger than just needing a place to crash. It was about believing that somewhere in the world there was space for exactly who he was. The hours that followed moved like water, slow and formless. I got up to make fresh tea, though the mugs from before sat untouched and cooling on the coffee table. It felt important to have something to do with my hands, some small ritual of care I could offer when words felt too fragile for what Simon was carrying. The kitchen felt different with him here, more alive somehow. The familiar sounds of boiling water and clinking ceramic took on new weight, like they were part of something larger than my usual solitary routines. I found myself moving more quietly, conscious of the way sound carried in the small space between us. When I returned to the living room, Simon had shifted on the couch, not quite lying down, but not sitting up either. His body, finding angles that suggested exhaustion, was finally winning over the adrenaline that had carried him here. The blanket I kept folded over the back of the couch had somehow made its way into his hands, and he was running his fingers along its edges like he needed something to anchor himself to. "Here," I said, setting the fresh mug on the table in front of him. "This one might actually stay warm long enough to drink." He smiled at that, the first real smile I'd seen since he'd appeared at my door. It was small and tired, but it reached his eyes in a way that made something loosen in my chest. "Thank you," he said, "not just for the tea, for all of this, for not asking questions I'm not ready to answer yet." I settled back onto the couch, closer than before, close enough that when he pulled the blanket around his shoulders, the edge of it brushed against my arm. The contact was light, almost accidental, but it sent warmth spreading through me in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "You don't have to thank me," I said. "This is what friends do." But even as I said it, the word felt insufficient. Friends was what we'd been for 3 years, but sitting here in the dark with him, wrapped in my blanket, the careful boundaries we'd maintained felt like they were shifting. Maybe they'd been shifting for months, and I'd been too careful to notice, too afraid to acknowledge what was happening between the spaces of our conversations. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that felt full rather than empty, charged with things neither of us was quite ready to name. Simon's breathing had settled into something deeper, more even, but his body still carried tension like he was waiting for something else to go wrong. I keep thinking about what he said. Simon spoke finally, his voice softer than before, about bringing shame to the family. Like loving someone could be shameful. Like being honest about who you were is something to apologize for. He shifted again, and this time when he moved, his knee brushed against mine. The contact was brief but deliberate, like he was testing the boundaries of the space between us, seeing what felt safe. "I've spent so many years trying to be the son he wanted," Simon continued. "Getting good grades, choosing the right major, dating the right kind of people. Well, the people he thought were right. Always wondering if I was performing well enough to earn the love that was supposed to be unconditional." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and without thinking, I reached over and covered his hand with mine. His skin was warmer now, no longer carrying the chill from his walk through the October night, but his fingers trembled slightly under my touch. He turned his hand, palm up beneath mine, and our fingers found each other in the blanket between us. The gesture was small, almost hesitant, but it felt enormous in the quiet of my apartment. Like we were crossing some invisible line we'd been walking carefully around for months. "You know what's crazy?" Simon said, looking down at our joined hands. "I feel more like myself sitting here with you than I have in years of trying to be what he wanted. Like I can breathe properly for the first time." The admission hung between us, heavy with implications neither of us was quite ready to examine. But I could feel the truth of it in the way his shoulders had finally relaxed, the way his breathing had deepened. Whatever mask he'd been wearing for his family, he left it somewhere between his father's house and my front door. I squeezed his fingers gently, and he squeezed back. The pressure was light but steady, like we were both testing the strength of this new connection, seeing how much weight it could hold. "It's terrifying," he said, "not having a plan, not knowing where I'm going to live, or how I'm going to explain this to everyone who matters. But also liberating. Like I finally get to find out who I actually am when I'm not trying to be someone else. Outside, The city was settling into the deep quiet of early morning. No more sirens or passing cars, just the gentle hum of the building around us. The radiator clicking on and off. The soft whisper of wind against the windows. Simon leaned closer, not quite against my shoulder, but near enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. The movement was gradual, careful, like he was asking permission without words. I stayed perfectly still, afraid that any sudden movement might break whatever spell was settling over us. "This feels different," he said, so quietly I almost missed it. "Being here with you. It doesn't feel temporary." I knew what he meant. The space between us had been charged with something for months, maybe longer. Careful glances that lasted a beat too long. Conversations that meandered toward territory that felt dangerous and thrilling. The way my heart sped up when he laughed at something I'd said, like his approval meant more than it should have. Now, with his father's rejection still raw between us, and his future uncertain, that careful distance felt impossible to maintain. Not when he was looking at me, like I might be the answer to questions he'd been afraid to ask. The quiet between us deepened as the night stretched on. Simon's breathing had settled into something steadier, but I could feel the weight of everything he was carrying in the way he held himself, even relaxed against my couch. His hand was still in mine, fingers intertwined in a way that felt both natural and revolutionary. I found myself studying the line of his profile in the dim light from the street outside. The way his dark hair fell across his forehead. The sharp angle of his jaw that I'd memorized during countless conversations but never allowed myself to really see before. Now, with the careful distance between us finally dissolving, I couldn't look away. He turned his head toward me, catching me watching him. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air felt charged with something I'd been pretending not to feel for months, maybe years. All those late-night conversations where we'd sat just a little too close. All those moments when his laugh had made my heart skip in ways I'd told myself meant nothing. "You know what keeps running through my head?" Simon said, his voice barely above a whisper. Something else my dad said before I left. I waited, not trusting my voice to come out steady if I tried to speak. He said no one would ever want me. Not really. Not like this. Said I'd spend my whole life pretending to be something I'm not because the real me isn't worth loving. The words hit me like cold water. I felt something fierce and protective rise in my chest. Anger at a man who could look at his own son and say something so deliberately cruel. But underneath the anger was something else, something that had been building for so long I'd stopped noticing its weight. Simon was still looking at me, his eyes searching my face like he was trying to read something written there. The vulnerability in his expression was almost too much to bear, raw and open in a way I'd never seen him before. "He's wrong," I said. The words came out before I could stop them, before I could think about what they might reveal. About what territory we'd be crossing if I said what I really meant. Simon's breath caught. Something shifted in his expression, hope and fear warring in his eyes. "He's wrong," I repeated, stronger this time, because the truth was too big to keep hidden anymore, too important to let his father's cruelty have the last word. Because Simon was sitting in my living room at 3 a.m, trusting me with his broken heart, and I couldn't let him believe for another second that he wasn't worth wanting. "You're worth loving," I said. "Exactly as you are. Not some version of yourself you have to perform for other people. You." The silence that followed felt different from all the others we'd shared. This one was full of recognition, of truth finally being spoken after years of careful avoidance. I could see understanding dawn in Simon's eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like wonder. "Caleb," he said, my name barely a breath between us. "How long have you?" I didn't let him finish the question. Couldn't, because the answer was complicated and simple at the same time. How long had I been attracted to him? How long had I been half in love with him? How long had I been telling myself that what I felt was just friendship when every conversation left me wanting more? "Since statistics class," I said. "Since you fell asleep on your textbook in the library that first week, and I spent 20 minutes just watching you breathe. Since you laughed at that terrible joke I made about probability distributions, and I realized I wanted to spend the rest of my life trying to make you laugh like that again." His eyes widened, and for a moment I thought I'd said too much too fast. Thought maybe the weight of his father's rejection was too fresh for him to process anything else this overwhelming. But then he smiled. Not the tired, fragile smile from earlier, but something bright and real that transformed his whole face. I thought I was imagining it, he said. All those times I caught you looking at me when you thought I wasn't paying attention. The way you'd find excuses to sit closer to me during our study sessions. The way you always remembered exactly how I like my coffee, down to the specific amount of sugar. I had been doing all those things, I realized. Small acts of attention and care that I'd told myself were just what good friends did for each other. But good friends didn't memorize the exact shade of brown their friends' eyes turned in afternoon sunlight. Good friends didn't lie awake at night thinking about the way their friend's voice sounded when they laughed. I wanted to tell you, Simon continued, his thumb tracing small circles across my knuckles. But I was so scared of ruining what we had. You were the one good thing in my life that felt uncomplicated, and I couldn't stand the thought of losing you because I couldn't keep my feelings to myself. The irony wasn't lost on me. We'd both been so careful to protect what we had that we'd almost missed what we could have. All those months of walking around the edges of something real, too afraid to step into the center and see what we might build there. Your father is wrong about you, I said again, needing him to hear it, to believe it. You're not too much or too complicated or too honest. You're exactly right, exactly as you are. Simon's eyes filled with tears, but these weren't the broken tears from earlier. These were different, relieved, grateful, like something that had been locked away inside him was finally free to breathe. He leaned closer, close enough that I could count his eyelashes in the dim light. Close enough that when he spoke, I could feel his breath against my lips. Can I? He started, then stopped. Started again. Would it be okay if I? Yes, I said, before he could finish asking. Whatever he needed, whatever he was ready for, the answer was yes. The word hung between us like a bridge I just built with my voice alone. Yes. Simple and certain, even as my heart hammered against my ribs hard enough that I was sure Simon could hear it in the quiet of my apartment. For a moment, neither of us moved. We were balanced on the edge of something that would change everything. And I think we both knew that once we stepped across this line, there would be no going back to the careful friendship we'd maintained for 3 years. No more pretending that the electricity between us was just coincidence. Simon's eyes searched my face one more time, looking for doubt or hesitation he wouldn't find. Because whatever fear I felt about crossing this boundary was nothing compared to the certainty that this was exactly where we were supposed to be. That all those months of walking around the edges of something real had been leading us here, to this moment, to this choice. He leaned closer, slow enough that I could have changed my mind, could have pulled back and laughed it off as exhaustion and too much emotion. But I didn't want to change my mind. I've been wanting this for so long that the anticipation felt like holding my breath underwater. When his lips finally touched mine, it was soft. Tentative. Like he was asking another question I was happy to answer. I kissed him back, gentle at first, then with more certainty as I felt him relax against me. His mouth was warm and tasted faintly of the tea he'd finally started drinking. His hand found the side of my face, fingers threading through my hair in a way that made me forget how to think about anything other than the weight of him, the reality of him, finally within reach. We broke apart after what could have been seconds or hours. Time had become negotiable, subject to the new physics of whatever was happening between us. Simon's forehead rested against mine, both of us breathing like we'd been running. I wanted to do that for so long, he whispered, his voice rough with something that sounded like relief. Me too, I said, because it was true and because there was no point in pretending otherwise. Not anymore. Not when he was close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count the freckles scattered across his nose that I'd memorized without meaning to. He settled back against the couch, but this time when he moved, he pulled me with him. Not demanding, just inviting, his hand finding mine again as we rearranged ourselves in the space between the cushions. I let myself be pulled closer, let my shoulder fit against his chest, let my head find the hollow between his collarbone and his neck. "This is better than I imagined," he said, his voice vibrating through his chest where my ear was pressed. And I imagined it a lot. I smiled against his skin, breathing in the scent of him that was familiar from years of friendship, but somehow different now. More vivid, more mine. The blanket had gotten tangled around us during the shift, and Simon adjusted it so it covered both of us. The gesture was domestic in a way that made my heart do something complicated and warm. Like we were already learning how to fit together, how to share space in ways that felt natural rather than negotiated. "Are you okay?" I asked, because despite everything that had just happened, I couldn't forget what had brought him here. The conversation with his father that had left him standing at my door with nowhere else to go. The weight he'd been carrying that was probably still there underneath the relief of finally being honest about what we felt. "I'm scared," he said, and I could feel the honesty of it in the way his arm tightened around me. Scared about what happens next, about where I'm going to live, how I'm going to finish school, whether I'll ever be able to go home again. But also scared about this, about us, about wanting something this much when everything else in my life just fell apart. I lifted my head to look at him, saw the vulnerability there that he was trusting me with, the fear that was real and valid and deserved to be acknowledged. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight," I said. "We can take this as slow as you need. Whatever this becomes, we'll figure out together." Together, he repeated like he was testing the weight of the word, like he was trying to believe that such a thing was possible. Together, I confirmed and kissed him again to seal the promise. This kiss was different from the first, less tentative, more sure, like we were both starting to believe that this was real, that it wasn't going to disappear if we stopped being careful with it. His hands found my face again, thumbs tracing the line of my cheekbones like he was memorizing the geography of this new territory we'd claimed. When we separated this time, Simon smiled. The first completely unguarded smile I'd seen from him all night. The kind of smile that reached his eyes and transformed his whole face into something that looked like hope. "I never thought I'd be grateful to my father for anything again," he said. "But if he hadn't pushed me out, I might never have been brave enough to end up here. To tell you how I felt." The irony wasn't lost on me either. That rejection had led to refuge, and refuge had become revelation. That sometimes the worst thing that could happen opened the door to the best thing you never knew you were waiting for. Outside, the city was settling deeper into the quiet hours before dawn. But inside my apartment, wrapped in blankets and each other's arms, it felt like the day was just beginning. Somewhere in the hours that followed, exhaustion finally won. Not the adrenaline-fueled tiredness that had carried Simon through his father's rejection and across town to my door, but the deep, bone-weary fatigue that comes after crisis has passed and safety has been found. We didn't plan for him to fall asleep. We were talking in whispers about small things, inconsequential things that felt enormous in the cocoon of blankets and newfound honesty we'd built around ourselves. About how different this felt from what either of us had imagined. About the way 3 years of careful friendship had shifted into something else entirely in the space of a single night. But gradually, Simon's responses grew softer, more scattered. His breathing deepened against my shoulder where his head had found its resting place. His hand, which had been tracing absent patterns on my arm, stilled and relaxed. I should have suggested he move to my bed, or at least help him stretch out more comfortably on the couch. Should have gotten him another pillow, or turned off the lamp in the corner that was still casting its warm glow across the living room. But I was afraid that any movement, any practical consideration of comfort, might break the spell of what had happened between us. So I stayed perfectly still as sleep claimed him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing and watching the way the light from outside shifted across the walls as the night deepened toward morning. His duffel bag still sat on the floor where he'd dropped it hours ago, untouched and somehow symbolic. All his worldly possessions, at least the ones he'd been able to grab in anger and hurt, contained in navy canvas. It should have looked temporary, like evidence of upheaval and uncertainty. Instead, it looked like the beginning of something, like baggage he needed to carry with him in order to arrive exactly where he belonged. I thought about the conversation with his father that had set all of this in motion. The cruel certainty in words designed to wound, to make Simon doubt his own worth. The way love had been twisted into conditions and ultimatums, used as a weapon rather than a refuge. But his father had been wrong about everything that mattered. Simon wasn't something to be ashamed of or hidden away. He wasn't a problem to be solved or a disappointment to be managed. He was exactly who he was supposed to be, and somehow miraculously he was here, in my arms, trusting me with the weight of his broken world and the tentative hope of whatever we were building together. The city began its slow transition toward dawn around us. I could hear the distant rumble of early commuter trains, the first tentative sounds of a world waking up. Street cleaners making their rounds on the avenue 6 blocks away. The buildings settling around us with small creaks and sighs. But inside my apartment, time felt suspended. Simon's warmth against my side, the rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers had curled loosely around the edge of the blanket we shared. Everything felt fragile and permanent at once, like something that needed protecting and something that could weather any storm. I found myself memorizing details I'd never allowed myself to notice before. The way his dark hair fell across his forehead when he wasn't consciously pushing it back. The small scar just above his left eyebrow that I'd never asked about. The exact shade of his skin in the dim morning light filtering through my windows. This was what I'd been afraid to want for 3 years. Not just Simon, though wanting him had been a constant ache I'd learned to live around. But this sense of completeness, of rightness, of finding the missing piece I hadn't even known I was searching for. Outside, the sky was lightening from deep blue to pale gray. Dawn wasn't dramatic in the city, not like it would have been in the mountains or by the ocean. It crept in gradually, more suggestion than announcement, painting the world in soft pastels that matched the quiet of the moment. Simon stirred slightly against me, some dream or distant sound pulling him toward wakefulness. But he didn't fully wake, just settled deeper in his sleep with a soft sigh that sounded content. Safe, like his body finally believed what his mind was learning to accept, that he was exactly where he needed to be. I stayed perfectly still, afraid to disturb him. Afraid to disturb this moment that felt like the pivot point between the life I'd been living and the one that was just beginning. All those careful boundaries we'd maintained, all those conversations where we danced around the truth of what we felt, seemed like preparation for this, for the courage to finally be honest about what we wanted. The morning light continued its slow advance across the wall above us, marking time in a way that felt both patient and inevitable. Soon, the city would be fully awake. Soon, we'd have to figure out practical things like breakfast and phone calls and what came next. But for now, there was just this. Simon breathing steadily against my shoulder, his trust a gift I'd spend the rest of my life trying to deserve. The weight of him in my arms, solid and real, and finally impossibly mine. What had begun as refuge, as a desperate knock on my door in the middle of the night, had already become something neither of us could give back. Something that felt like home in ways that had nothing to do with the walls around us, and everything to do with the space we'd learned to create together. I closed my eyes and let myself fall into the rhythm of his breathing, into the promise of whatever came next.